With Umbraco v12, we now have an officially supported way to build headless websites with Umbraco. Now, if you're wondering, how do I get on this sweet gravy train, then this video is going to help. So in today's pretty packed video, we're going to be looking at the Content Delivery API, how to install it, what endpoints, and a deep dive into all the things you need to do in order to use it efficiently. Now, because the video is so long, I'm going to keep this intro short, so the only things for me to say is I do a video every single Sunday, so if you haven't subscribed already, click subscribe. I've also created a follow-on tutorial for everything you're about to see today. It's linked to below, so check that out so it saves you typing from stuff on screen. Otherwise, let's get to the good stuff. After you install Umbraco v12, the Content Delivery API will be turned off by default. So your first task is to enable everything. And in order to enable the Content Delivery API, the first thing you need to do is open up Visual Studio and then go to your web solution and open up appsettings.json. After you get to appsettings.json, you want to scroll down until you find this Umbraco section, and then within CMS, you're going to need to add in a brand new configuration option, which is called Delivery API. Now, we're going to get back to some of these options later on, but the key thing at this stage is that you put this property called enabled and you make it true. Now, aside from turning on the API in config, the second thing that you need to do is register the dependencies that the Content Delivery API needs to use when your website boots up. And we can do that within program.cs. Now, within my example right here, you can see that I'm using the minimal hosting bundle option. This means I've got a single program.cs and everything's all good. And I don't have a startup.cs. Now, within Umbraco, this type of configuration isn't officially supported yet. So even though Umbraco 12 works with .NET 7, this, it kind of works. So it might be useful for a few of you to understand why I'm saying it's not officially supported. So I've quickly switched program.cs's, and this is an example of a program.cs, which you can see down here, which is making use of startup. Now, within this program.cs, you can see where I've got my create default builder, and I've got this configure Umbraco defaults. Now, this thing needs to trigger, otherwise Umbraco is going to fail when it boots up, with loads of kind of unknown program errors, all that kind of stuff. Now, if we go back to my program.cs, we don't actually have that option to do this configure Umbraco defaults. And if we try and do this on the web hosting builder, you'll see that I go builder configure Umbraco defaults, and we're going to get an error because it doesn't officially exist. Now, because it doesn't officially exist, the hacky way to get around this is to add in these two lines of config, where we do app services, get required runtime, determine runtime level, and this is going to make everything work. However, this is a hack and it's not the officially supported way. So you might bump into issues if you use this. However, for my testing, it works. Just in terms of Content Delivery API, the important thing that you need to register happens in Add Umbraco. From here, you can see I've got this line, Add Delivery API. And this is the call which is going to register all the dependencies that we need for Content Delivery API to work as expected. Now that we've enabled the Content Delivery API, we can just do a .NET run. This is then going to compile the site, launch my website in a debugger. Then you can see that I can access it on port 44351. And then if I go to say Postman, and we'll come back to this in a minute, I've got my request to the Content Delivery API. If I do a send, we can see that we've got some data back and everything's up and running. Now, before we move into the deep dive of the APIs themselves, it's worth pointing out that Umbraco now ships with Swagger. Now, if you haven't come across Swagger before, have you been living under a rock, man? So Swagger is basically a way for software vendors to be able to document their APIs. Now, in order to access your Swagger, you can do Umbraco, Swagger, and then index.html. Now, once you get to this page, you want to swap this default API to the Umbraco Delivery API. And from here, you can see that you get access to the documentation for all of the APIs. And if we expand this, you can see that we can get some examples. We have an understanding about, what parameters it takes. We can see the JSON it's going to return, the requests it's going to make, all of that good stuff. So, a key thing to keep in mind when you're working with Content Delivery API, you're always going to have Swagger to work with locally if you want to check what you can do or how something works. Now, before we move into what the endpoints actually do, another little hidden gotcha that can catch you out is all around caching. So, on the screen you can see that we've only got 7 results. However, if we look on my page right here, you can actually count there's 8 things. Now, in order to fix this issue, what you need to do sometimes is clear your Content Delivery API cache. So we can do that by going to Settings, going to Examiner Management, and then from here you can see that there's a new index which is called the Delivery API Content Index. So if we click on here, and then we go to the bottom and go to Rebuild Index, this should regenerate our cache, and as you can see on screen, I've now got the 8 results that I was expecting. So, now that we've got everything up and running, the next thing to do is look at the 3 endpoints exposed by the Content Delivery API and look at how you're going to implement them within your front-end headless website. Out of the box, the Content Delivery API exposes 3 endpoints for you to make use of. So first up, we have the Content API. So this is going to return multiple types of content. Next, we have the Get Content by ID. And then finally, we have Get Content by Segment or Path. Out of these 3 endpoints, we're going to start off by looking at the content endpoint. And in order for you to really understand how it works, you're probably going to need to understand the layout of my Umbraco instance. So let's have a look at all the document types and the page structure before we move on. Okay, so we're now inside my Umbraco 12 headless sample site. Remember, you can get access to this site from my GitHub, link is below. Now, in this particular instance, you can see that I've created 3 document types. So one which is called homepage, one which is called blog, and one which is called private. And if we look at the homepage and we look at permissions, you can see that we can create blog and private underneath it. Now going back to the content tab up here, you can see that I've created a homepage called homepage. Then I've created blog 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and we've also got our settings page, and settings is of type private. And we'll get to that in a minute. Now, in order to access all of this content in one go, we can use the Content API. So what you want to do is add in your URL, then we put in Umbraco, delivery, API, -v1, and then content. After making the request, you'll get some JSON which returns the total, which is a count of the number of results, then an items array. And in the items array, you're basically going to get an entry for each item returned. So within here, expect to have things like the name, we've got access to the route and the path, which will be useful later on. We also get access to the page ID. Again, this could be useful later on for querying. We also get access to the content type, and then we also have an array which contains all the properties on that document type. Now, being able to get all the content created in the CMS in one go is kind of neat. However, practically, when are we actually ever going to use it? So there's basically 2 ways when you're creating a headless website that you'll need to use this endpoint. Now the first one is when you're creating something like a listing page. However, when we're creating a listing page, we want to do something like pagination. And this is where the skip and the take command comes into play. Now, if you've done any type of pagination before, you're probably well aware of skip and take. So you can see skip and take in action here. So skip is basically the number of items to skip, so the page you want to get to, and take is the number of items to return in a single hit. So moving back to the postmans, we can have a look at how our take and skip query should look like. So you can see here that we have our normal content endpoint, then at the end as a query string, we just add the take and a skip. Now, as you can see, after I run the same command with take and skip, you can see that I've now got blog 2. So what I'm doing is taking one item and I'm taking it from the second page, which is blog 2. Now, if I change this to say 3 items and I want to do it on page 1, you'll see that we now get blog 1, blog 2 and blog 3 return. So you guessed it, if you need to do pagination, start adding in these parameters to your query. Another potential issue so far is that this query is going to return every single bit of content in the CMS regardless of the document type that it was created by. Now, typically, whenever I'm creating a listing page, I typically want to only return results by a given content type or document type. So the good news is that the Content API also has a filter property. So let's have a look at that. So if we go to this one, you can see that we've got our typical Content API call here. However, now I've added in a filter. So you can see that we've got filter equals, and then it's content type, colon, and then the content type that we want to filter by. So in my instance, blog. Now, when I do a search this time, you can see my total results are 6, and now I've filtered out my home page. And if I go through here, you can see that I've just got blog pages. So by using filter, skip, and take, you can create a pretty killer listing page however you need to. Well, that covers our first use case of listing pages. And the second reason why you might use this endpoint is when you're using static site generation in your headless site. So let's say that we're using Next.js. What happens in Next.js is that at build time, a call will be made to every single template within your page directory. Now, assuming that you're using dynamic routing, a call will be made to get static paths. Now, in get static paths, you'll need to query the CMS to get all the URLs for all the pages that you want to convert to static HTML in one go. Then within something like get static props, you'll make an additional call back to the CMS to get data about that specific page. So in summary, when you're using static site generation with something like a Next.js, when you're crafting your query within get static paths, it's going to look something a bit like this. Now, from the results, what you'll want to do is either get the path property, which is here, or the ID property, which is here, and then make an additional query back to Umbraco to get specific information about that page. And coincidentally, the next endpoint that we're going to look at will allow us to do just that. The next endpoint that we're going to look at is called Get Content by ID. Now, the URL structure for this endpoint is kind of similar to the last one. So we're still doing our Umbraco delivery API v1/contents. However, this time we're going to add on item and then the ID at the end. Now, just in case you don't know how to get the ID, if you log into Umbraco itself, click on any bit of content, scroll to the properties tab, scroll to the bottom, and you can see you've got this GUID. And it's this GUID that you want to copy into your Postman in order to query a bit of content. So let's go to my collections. Let's do a get by ID. Let's pass in this ID, do a search, and you can see I've got my information about the homepage. Now, out of the 3 endpoints, I think get by ID is probably the one that you're going to use the least. Now, the reason for this is that you're not going to know the internal Umbraco ID in your front end. So picture this, we're in our headless website, someone's made a request to load one of our pages. So the request comes in via URL. Now, we don't have the internal Umbraco ID here. The only thing we have is this path, segment, URL, whatever you want to call it. And this is the reason why Umbraco has the third API endpoint, which is get by path. So get by path or get by route is structured very similar to the get by ID endpoint. So it's still Umbraco delivery API v1 content item, except for this time we just pass in the path rather than the ID in the last instance. So yes, it says route, but this is basically the segment. So if we go back to our get all content endpoints, you can see that when we make our requests, we've got a route path variable right here. So it's basically this thing here that we need to pass in. Or if we're on our front end website, it's basically this thing here that we need to pass in. So everything from Umbraco all the way to the word to. Thinking about our headless architecture again, if you're creating something like a single page application or you're using a server-side rendering, then you're going to have to generate pages on demand. So whenever a request comes in by an incoming URL, then the best thing to use is that get by routes, get by path endpoint in Umbraco. We have now covered the basics of what the API endpoints do. It's now time to take a more deep dive and advanced look. And the first thing we're going to look at is how do you deal with document types that link with other document types. It's a mystery. We're now back inside my sample site, and you can see that I've updated some of my document types to have a few properties. So in the private settings document type, you can see I've now got a texturing and a content picker. In my home page, you can see that I've also got a content picker, which I've called link. Now, moving back to the content tab, let's look at how I've structured things now. So on my home page, you can see I've got that content picker, and I've picked the settings page. So remove, add, there we go, click settings. Then if I look on my settings page, you can see that I've added in some private data, and I've also created a link back to the home page. Now that I've updated my content, let's have a look at how the updated JSON looks. So I've done my get content by GUID, and on here you can see that I've got my home page, I've got my ID, I've got my roots, and this time within my properties array, you can see I've now got the link property. In here you can see that it's linking to the settings page, I've got the path, and I've got the ID if I want to requery it. And you can see here that I've also got an additional property, which is called properties, which is empty. Now, this setup is all fine and dandy. However, if I want to get data from settings, I'm going to have to make two queries, which is not ideal. First, to get the information about the home page, and then a second one to get information from the settings page, using either the root or the ID. Or do I? Whenever you need to use something like a content picker and you need data from a child or linked to item, this is where this expand property can come into play. Now, using this, super simple. Let's go back to Postman. So we're still going to use our original query. However, this time at the end of the query, we're going to add a query string, which is expand equals property colon, and then we're going to add in the name of the property that we want to expand. With our new query executed, let's see how the JSON's been updated. So we still have all the original data as you'd expect. Now, if we go into properties, we can see we have link, and if we scroll down, we can see that now this properties collection has been updated. Now, when we look in here, you can see that we have private one, so we're pulling in data from that settings page. We've also got that link property, which I've defined on the settings page, which is now linking back to homepage. Now, the interesting thing here is that if we look a level deep, our link property is returning, data about the homepage, like the name, the route. However, its properties collection is empty. Now, when I set this up, I purposely had it so the homepage linked to the settings page, which linked back to the homepage. And obviously, if Umbraco tried to recurse down that tree and load everything, it would have got itself in an infinite loop, and something would have blown up eventually with a Stack Overflow. So it's a good thing to keep in mind that if you want to expand one level deep, no problem. However, when you get to this second level of nesting, you'll likely need to use the get by ID or get by path route, whatever you want to call it. I think things are going pretty well at the moment. However, we have one massive issue: security. Now, at the moment, anyone who knows this endpoint can basically query for all the content within our CMS. And let's scroll down here. What we'll find is, oh yeah, my settings page with my private data is being exposed. So this means that anyone in the whole of the world can get access to this private data, which is not ideal. So what we want to do is lock our API down. And the first way to do that is to go back to our app settings.json. We are now back inside our app settings.json, and I've uncommented two of the lines that we looked at earlier. Now, by default, the content delivery API, when enabled, will be public. However, by using these two properties here, we can lock it down. So the first one you want to know about is public access. So what you want to do is set this to false, and I recommend that you probably do this on every project that you set up. Now, after the API is locked down, you'll need a way to access it, and we can do that using an API key. So what we need to do is supply a host header called API key whenever we're making a request. Now, the API key that you add here can be anything you want. So in my example, I've just done my dash key. However, what you'll probably want to do is have some sort of GUID or something a bit more complicated than this. After locking down the API in your app settings.json, don't forget to reboot your development server. Now, when I do a request to get content, you'll see that instead of getting JSON, I'm now getting a 401 error unauthorized. So we can get rid of this error by adding in a key. So if I just do my API-key, and then I put my key in, which was my -key. Now, if I send a new request, you'll see I've got my data and I've got rid of my unauthorized error. Now, that was step 1 in order to make our API secure. However, we're still returning sensitive data within our JSON. So how can we fix this? When you have document types that might contain sensitive data, what you can do is use this disallow content type alias property. So it takes in an array. What we can do is pass in my document type name, which is private. So now when I make a request to try and load that settings page, you'll see that I get a 404 not found error. The disallow content type alias is an essential step to set whenever you have a document type that might contain sensitive data. As you've seen, as soon as you blacklist a certain document type, whenever you query for it, you'll get a 404 error. However, there is still something you need to be aware of because it's still possible to actually get access to that sensitive data even though we've locked it down. Now, the good news is that if I do a search for get all items using the content API, if you scroll down, you can see that my settings page doesn't exist here. Even though if we look in the CMS, you can see that it's listed under my homepage. Now, where the issue comes is that if we do an expand equals property link. So if I search, remember that on my homepage, I added a link or content picker to my settings page. And if I look in here, you can see that by adding in property link, I've now actually exposed this private data that I wanted to keep secret. So this is definitely something to be mindful of if you need to create a headless website with Umbraco, because it's very easy to accidentally expose secret data via the API. Now in my instance, one way that I could fix this is by adding validation. So you can see that I've got my settings page. Now maybe I want to move this so it lives under the root item. With the parent of the settings page now under root, what we can do is go back to our document type, go to homepage, and then we can edit our content picker. Now, one of the properties on the content picker is the ability to set a start node. So now what I can do is set my start node to be the home page. Now I can submit this, can save it. Now I can go back to my home page, and if I'm a content editor and I want to add a link to another page, when I click on the add button, this time I won't have the option to pick settings, so I can pick say blog 1. Now if I do a save and publish, if I go to my postmans, when I do my search, you can see that my private data is nice and safe. With that in mind, my content modeling tip is that when you're creating settings pages, you should have them as the root element. And then if you need to do a content picker, make sure that you always set the start node to be the root of your homepage. And this way, people won't accidentally be able to pick the settings page on your website. Before we move on to the next topic, I want to bring up one final security-related concern, and that is CORS. Now, CORS isn't exactly Umbraco specific. However, whenever you're building a headless website, the chances are that your website domain and your CMS domain will be slightly different, maybe a subdomain. Now, in this instance, even though we've locked everything down in appsettings.json, you don't want to leave your API open for anyone in the world to query. So don't forget within your program.cs or your startup.cs to register CORS and register your origins. Now, I'm not going to go into a full tutorial over CORS. If you'd like to see one, someone leave a comment below. However, what we want to do in program.cs is do something like use CORS. Then we've got a few things like, allow any method, and then we can set, with origin, or we can set is origin allowed, all this good stuff. So whenever you're setting up your headless API, make sure you think about CORS. So we're back in the sample site, and as you'll see, I've added in a content area of texturing to my blog page. Now, if I go to my blog 1, let's add in some content, and this time, instead of publishing it, I'm just going to save it. Now, what do you think is going to happen when we load up Postman? So I've got Postman, I've done a query, you can see my content area is null. Now, obviously, this is going to pose a problem whenever we're trying to preview content. And this is the reason why Umbraco Content Delivery API also ships with a preview attribute. So in order to enable preview mode, you're going to need to add in a brand new value as a host header. So let's move this down. And from here, we need to have preview, and this needs to equal true. So now if I do my send, if we look at my data, you can see that in my content area, I've got my nonsense. So by adding that simple host header, you can get access to draft content so you can build a preview for your content editors. Now granted, we have covered a lot in this video, but hopefully by now you should have a good understanding how to build anything using the Content Delivery API. Now obviously, when it comes to building a headless website with Umbraco, the API is one aspect, but how do we actually build that website? So in the future, maybe expect a video on headless website development coming up. Also, for those of you who want to learn more about Umbraco, it's worth me mentioning that I've created a book all about Umbraco.net Core Web Development called Umbraco.net Core Mastery. Now, the book's about $14.99. It's available for you to have a look at LeanPub, and the link to is below. So if you want to support the channel, learn more about Umbraco, then I recommend checking out that book. Now, if you have enjoyed this video, then please click like. It takes me something about 20-30 hours to create one of these videos, and it really does keep me motivated to carry on creating it if I know people are finding value from it. Also, if you do want to see the follow-up video and you haven't already, don't forget to hit subscribe. Now, the final thing I'll say is that if you just want to learn more about Umbraco 12, then check out my feature tour video, the link for which is on the video screen right now. Otherwise, I hope you're having an amazing time wherever you are, and until next Sunday, happy coding.